Thank you, Barb. It's great to be here on the Dented Fender this morning. As I share with you today, I want to recall some events at the first of the year. You can see I wear glasses, and I started having trouble reading books as I was laying in bed. Kind of started having to adjust the books just so in order to be able to read. And then when I went to the office, it got even harder there as I was trying to adjust my chair and seeing the computer and trying to read what I need to read. And things just kept getting harder and harder. And so I knew that it was pretty much time for a new prescription. And then COVID-19 hit. And the country shut down, and I knew that there was no place to go to get new glasses. And so the best I could do in the interim was to basically just get some new readers and hope for the best and try to cope. I rely pretty heavily on my vision, as I'm sure many and most of you may do, especially in my work as a chaplain. But I also rely very heavily on my vision for my hobbies, for reading, for writing, reading to my grandchildren, doing some of the crafts that I enjoy. And when things are difficult to see, I am really not having my best life. It is God's plan for me and for you to live life to the fullest. In John's Gospel, in chapter 10, verse 10, Jesus says, "I came that they may have life and have it abundantly." Friends, as people of God, we are called to seek ways to live a life of abundance, a life where we thrive and not just survive. Yet so many of us, and even more so since COVID-19, since we've been experiencing racial unrest because of the addictions that we face or the family dynamics that we're in challenges with or family issues, we find that we are just surviving. And some of us are barely surviving. I am that person. I have been that person, and I am that person right now, one who is barely surviving. You see, 3 years ago, my husband of 28 years unexpectedly died while on a bike ride. My life and the life of my children was flipped upside down. My heart was ripped in half. My life's vision was gone. And honestly, I was not sure that I could even move forward myself. Now, as a pastor, and I was serving a church at the time, I lost my desire and I lost the words that I needed to pray. Now, that's a little bit of a challenge when you're serving as a pastor. And don't get me wrong, I still prayed in my vocation there, but I think the words were somewhat hollow. I think that I wasn't sure that they were actually coming from the heart. And what I really found in myself that was happening for about 3 months, I prayed just these simple words: why and help. God help. A dear friend of mine made the observation that those are the words that a child utters or pleads to a parent when they are struggling. And I guess I was actually praying to God, who is my heavenly parent, and God was listening to my prayers. You see, I had lost my vision. I had lost what was going to come next. But I discovered that I had not lost my connection with God. Not at all. On the night that my husband died, honestly, I wondered if I could possibly move forward. I wondered if I could even get to the next day of my life. More urgently, though, I actually wondered if I could possibly fall asleep with such a heavy weight in my life at that moment. And boy, did I need the sleep. And so I asked God to hold this hard thing for me just for the night so that I could sleep. And you know what? God did hold it, and I did sleep. Don't get me wrong. The split second that I woke up, God dumped it back into my lap. And I knew instantly upon my waking that this horrible thing had happened. And once again, I was suffocating under the weight of the grief that I was feeling. And yet, in the asking, I knew God was with me in this terribly hard thing, this thing that I could not explain, this thing that changed my life. And so, for weeks, night after night after night, I asked God to hold it, to hold my grief. And each morning, God gave it back. God held this deep, excruciating despair for me so that I could get just a decent, somewhat night's sleep. Sorry about that. My notes. It is this amazing, never-ending presence of God that has brought me to this place 3 years later. 3 years later. This place where I find that I am beginning to not just survive, but I'm actually starting a little bit to thrive. There have been many, many, many dark days and nights, too numerous to count, where I have been wandering in the dark tunnel of despair. And yet every time, and I mean every time, that I find myself stuck in the darkness, I know that I just need to reach out my hand, to reach out my heart to the one who has been with me through the hardest time in my life. And as I reach out, as I reach up to God, I find God's presence and experience a peace like no other. Yet I realize this is just survival. It's not thriving. Knowing that I could not move forward on my own accord was very difficult. And so I put my trust in God. And as I trusted and as I reached out, I began to see beyond the despair that was my husband's death and the future of my life alone. And I was able to see finally to the hope that the Creator offered me in the trusting that I was doing. And the Creator offers that to you as well. COVID-19 further magnified the loneliness that I was feeling, as it probably did for a lot of you. And I longed for intimate connection. I longed for time with friends and family, and social distancing just made it so that was not possible. And I cried out again to God. I cried out it with those simple words once again. God, why? God, help me through this hard thing. Because I knew that in this isolation of COVID-19, I had fallen once again into the despair, much like it had felt in those early months. And repeatedly, God spoke to my aching heart, terribly aching heart. And God was telling me that there was still an abundant life there for me, that I was starting to get a glimpse of it, that God had not abandoned me and that God was preparing this abundant life for me. And yet it didn't seem like it would ever come. And God kept reassuring me at the heart level of my life. Throughout these 3 years, this peace, this reassurance from God kept showing up for me in Jeremiah 29. And you may be familiar with this passage, 29 verses 11 through 14. Jeremiah the prophet says, I know, and these are God's words speaking through Jeremiah, I know the plans I have in mind for you, plans for peace and not for disaster, to give you a future filled with hope. When you call on me and come and pray, I will listen to you, says the Lord. There's more. Just wait, there is definitely more. And God says, when you search for me, you will find me. I will be present for you, declares the Lord. What a promise from God, that God says, I have a life of abundance planned for you. I would not abandon you. My vision of despair had turned to God's vision of hope and an abundant life for me. I couldn't on my own see past my despair without God's help of showing me the hope and the abundant life that was coming. With God's vision guiding my life instead of my own vision guiding me. I found that I am trusting God even more. I'm trusting God with my vocation. I'm trusting God with my friendships. I'm trusting God with my day-to-day life and decision making. I'm allowing God to be my guide, to show me the way. It is God who has inspired me, who has gifted and sent encouragers into my life that encourage me to tell my story of grief. No matter how hard it is, no matter how many tears come as I tell this story, and of the faith and how God has helped me move from a place of deep despair to a place of overwhelming hope. Because I'm not stuck there anymore. I might wander there every now and again when things get hard, but I don't get stuck there because I am being led by God's vision to God's hope of abundance. Friends, my vision is God's vision. My words are God's inspired words. My grief and my struggles are real, don't get me wrong, and they're not gone. They're still there, and they will continue to be there. And yet I am beginning, after 3 years, the transition from surviving now to thriving. It's a good place to be. And I didn't get here easily. I got here with God's help and guidance and presence in my life. God has sent some wonderful people into my life to walk this hard time with me. And I know they are gifts from God because they have helped me move forward in my life. Friends, you may have your own struggles. It's okay. Name them. What are they? What are you dealing with that has caused you to plummet into your own dark tunnel time? If you've still not allowed God's vision for you, for your life to take over, because I couldn't do this alone. I invite you to let God guide your actions, to let God's vision show you how to take the next step, to let God's vision show you how to move forward. As I shared in the beginning from John 10:10, think on this important thing that Jesus says. Jesus came that you, my friends, may have an abundant life. It's possible because of God's love and power and grace in your life. It happened in my life. I still don't know what this abundant life is about, but I'm starting to get glimpses of it. It's the hope that God is putting before me that would not be there were I not trusting God. And God offers that to you too. God invites you to allow God's vision to be your vision and for you to exchange your own vision for God's vision. And then God can then lead you to choose people in your life, to choose activities and vocation, all the things that will bring you an abundant life, all of the things that will allow you to thrive and not just survive. Because just surviving is no fun. Just surviving is lonely and hard and isolating, and it allows you to drop back into the tunnel of your despair if you're just barely surviving. Believe me, I was just there not all that long ago as the hard things tried to weigh me down again. But I went back to my God and put my vision back into God, let God's vision be my vision. And 3 years later, 3 years after that horrible day when my husband was no longer here, I finally see God's vision for my bright future, God's vision for my life that is abundant, and the place where I am able to thrive. Friends, God has a future for you too. God has a future for me. Unfortunately, the details haven't all come into view yet. Again, got that vision problem. They're not quite clear, and then that's God's way of doing things in God's own time. And I get a little antsy and a little anxious wanting it to happen in my time. But I remember that God has not failed me yet, and God will not fail me. And I know it's okay to be a little anxious and a little antsy with God. And I know that God has not abandoned me in my hardest time and will not abandon me in the future. And friends, God will not abandon you either. Just put your trust in God's vision for your life. God's vision can show you the abundance that is there. I trust in God, and I am starting to live my abundant life as I do. God doesn't promise that I won't have hard days. I still have them. But on those hard days, I spend a little extra time in the morning with God. On those hard days, I reach out just a little bit higher to God. And on those days, I trust just a little bit harder that God will see me through the hard things. And I'm a little gentle with myself on those days because I know that I have to be. God encourages me to be gentle with myself. Because when I'm gentle with myself, when I follow God's guidance, when I follow God's vision, it is then that I'm living my best and most abundant life. I pray you will too. Thank you for letting me spend this time with you.